Hey, welcome back everybody to my channel, Advanced Programming Concepts using C++. Name is Professor Alex Louis here. So today we're going to jump from pointers to two-dimensional arrays. And so far, in terms of using my other class, you learned up to one-dimensional arrays, and we've never really touched upon the two-dimensional until, obviously, till now. And I did want to explain to you why you would want to use a two-dimensional array and apply it, and then that actually will help you in dealing with vectors. So if you listen to my original lectures, a lot of the examples that I use are, with students and then test scores, right? So say you have a student and this student has, let's say they have 5 test scores, right? So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Right. So if I wanted to find the test scores for the student, then I'd declare a one-dimensional array, an integer array, and then I'd populate it with the student's test scores from a file or just read it from input. And that's all well and dandy, but what if I had, let's say, 15 students or 20-something students? Then things are going to get a little fishy with a one-dimensional array, because what you'd have to do is you'd probably have to declare 15 different one-dimensional arrays. So you'd have student 1, student 2, and then student 2 would be its own array. So essentially what you're doing is you're going back to the problem of declaring separate variables, because now instead of having a one-dimensional flat outline of data, you now have a two-dimensional outline of data where you're going to have a student, and then for each student you're going to have a score. So what we call this is really a table type data, okay? And there's many table handling algorithms that we can use, but again, I'm not going to go there yet. We may touch upon a little bit of dynamic programming, but before we even get to that point, we need to understand how to process two-dimensional arrays and how they look. So this is the old way, right? The new way graphically would look like a table. So you'd have a table here, and depending on what you're keeping in data, in this case we're keeping scores, that's your column data. So you'd have something like that. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So these columns would represent the scores. Now we want to do a cross-section relation with each student. So we'd have S1. So sorry, it should be closer. S1 should be here, and then this whole row would be for S1. So, we can say 70, 80, 90, 100, and then 60, right? Then you'd have S2 over here, and that would be that student's row, and then that would be that student's row, and then so forth, right? You still have the concept of sizes, but the one thing that I want you to get initially is that this table type format of data, you're going to have a relation of rows and columns. And at this point, if you're taking this class and you're still being introduced to the world of programming, you have not been introduced to databases and tables. Or else if you had, this actually would be easier to understand. But I'm looking at this the perspective of a student. I'm teaching this to a student that has no idea what a table is, and column relationships and primary keys and all that. So in that sense, we're actually going to the nitty-gritty, where this would represent a row. So your students are rows, and then your columns are your scores. Okay, because that's what that thing here is. Right, so each box is a score. 35, 65, 22, 72, 55, right? That looks like my grades in my physics class. And each individual box can be accessed by its row column index. In this case, let's say I wanted to get the score for student 2. I wanted to get his third exam score. The student 2, so we can say that this is row 0, row 1, row 2, and row 3. So the way we would read this is, in terms of access, is first we'd indicate, well, what row is student 2 located? Student 2 is located in row 2, but it's index 1, right? So if we were to access this in terms of just subscript notation, I'd want student 2, which is row 1, index 1, and I want his third exam score, which is this over here, right? And easily we can get from the column index. Okay, so this combination of row and column, the value for this would be 22. And we can read this as row 1, column 2. And this type of notation is something you'll need to understand and get used to, because that's how we're going to access different data from our table. But it's important that you visualize this in terms of a table format, so that then once it comes time to programmatically represent this in a two-dimensional array, you have a visual representation of the table in your head, right? So at most, you will have 2 dimensions of data. The first dimension representing the rows, and then the second dimension is going to represent the columns. Okay? So let's take a look at some code here. Now, just a word of warning. When you're iterating through, because you're going to have to use loops. I mean, you have no choice. When you're iterating through a two-dimensional array, you have to understand nested loops. If you don't understand nested loops, I'm going to advise you to go back to my videos on for loops and look at where I go over nested loops. Okay, because if you are here and not fully understanding nested loops, then you're going to get lost. So at least have a fundamental understanding of nested loops. Okay, so we're trying to create a program that is going to, let's say, populate a two-dimensional array that represents students and scores. Okay, so let's do that real quick. Let's go back here. Okay, as always, I am going to include my headers. All right, so for a two-dimensional array, the base data type is going to be the same for both dimensions. So if I go back to my drawing here, the rows and columns have to be the same type. Okay, so in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to declare a two-dimensional integer array. The array is just going to keep the score data, right? But I need the 2 dimensions to indicate which is which in terms of students and which score, right? So if I just do int scores, the first dimension I told you is my rows. So we're just going to have 3 students, and then we'll say we'll have 5 scores. Okay. Cool. So what I just did here, okay, what I just did here is I did this. I created 3 rows, right? And then 5 columns. Right, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 0, 1, 2. Now to populate this array, this two-dimensional array, I have to do a nested loop. One is going to iterate through each row, right? And then the inner loop is going to go through the column itself. Okay, so if we can think of this in terms of a visual, is we can say that when we're in row 1, we want to go to column 0, column 1, column 2, column 3, and column 4. At each one, we want to populate data. Okay? Then what we want to do is we want to go to row 2. Okay? And then when we go to row 2, we're going to do the same thing. Go to column 0, column 1, column 2, column 3, and column 4. And we'll populate data. And then we go to row 3 and then iterate through each column. So column 1, column 0, column 1, column 2, column 3, and column 4. So the way that you would do this in terms of starting this is you'd probably want to create an outer loop. This is your outer, right? To just iterate through the rows. So we can do that easily. Okay, so for int I is less than 3, I plus plus. 3 because we have 3 rows, right? Now the inner loop, which represents this thing here, right, is going to go again from 0 to 5. So we can say for int j, you know what, let's call these rows and columns. This way it's less confusing. This is column, same thing, column 0. Column is less than 5 and call plus plus. So one tip, okay, when we're starting here, you have to know that the outer loop is always going to have the first index in your two-dimensional array, and the inner loop is always going to have the second index for its condition, okay, the actual length. So that's an easy way to kind of set this up real quick. Now, what we want to do is we want to tell the user, hey, populate a score. So populate a score for student, and then we can say student 1, right? So how do I represent this in terms of Cin? So it's simple. Think about where you're at, right? So when row is 0, so I'll say R is 0, and column is 0, where in the box am I? I'm over here, right? I'm over here. So that means that I can do something like Cin scores, and then what row am I in? 0. And what column am I in? 0. Right? But we're not using literals. We're using R and J, row and col, right? So we can say scores of row and then of col. because row is going to keep iterating, and then row is going to iterate, and then on wherever row it is, column is going to increment continuously until it's done, right? So when we're at row 0, it's going to go here, 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 done. Move the pointer over here, 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 and done. So what we want to do now is we just want to say scores of row and call. Okay, and if we do that, so student 1 will get a 70, 80, and then 90. Now at this point, it's 5 scores, right? So 70, 80, 90, 100, and 50. Okay, so notice how for student 1, I was able to populate the 5 scores, right? It's going to do the same thing for student 2. So 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. So let me show you how this looks visually. Okay, how this looks visually. So for student 1, okay, we've done this: 70, 80, 90, 100, and 50. And then for student 2, we've done 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. So notice how for each row I'm going across, right? Then we're going to go to the third student and do 90, 20, 80, 20, and 95. Okay, so with that I did 90, and I'm going in the row in the order of how the loop is going. 20, 80, 20, and 95. And at that point, we're going to exit out of our inner loop, and then our row is going to increment, right, up to 3, and then this just pops out. So on the next video, I'm going to show you how we can print these things out. But what I want you to do is I want you to use this code and then try and print out the data yourself and see if you can do that. And then on the next video, I'll show you and you can check your answer. Okay, and then we'll do more fun stuff on how to process data and actually read data from a file into a two-dimensional array. So I hope to see you on the next video.